Okay, good morning. Welcome, everybody. So let's just give a brief recap of what we covered last week, and then we'll get right into what we're doing here. And at this point, we're trying to establish basically the original created situation on the earth, or order on the earth, where basically we had water, the expanse, and then water below that, the subterranean chambers, and then the mantle underneath, which is critical here, I think, in understanding this passage here. So last week we talked about this word raqia, which is a Hebrew word that has 9 usages in Genesis chapter 1. The first 4 specifically have to do with the creation of the waters above and the waters below this raqia, or this, basically it's translated sometimes as expanse or firmament, and sometimes I think erroneously actually as sky. So the 5th usage is unusual, or is different, because it basically states that God names the raqia. So he's now naming the raqia, and he names it a Hebrew word called shemayim. And shemayim can have several meanings, and we're going to talk about that just a little bit in brief again today here. And we've discussed that previously some have interpreted this raqia as a dome above the earth, and made out of water. And there's a flood model that was developed from that called vapor canopy theory, which we covered last week. And we covered some of the scientific and biblical issues or problems with the vapor canopy theory. But basically it's this water vapor canopy that was placed in the atmosphere during creation. If you think that the water vapor was above an expanse, and the expanse is sky, this is what you would kind of deduce here. But there's many scientific issues and theological issues with this. And so this dome is supposedly is what collapses when the flood starts and provides the water to flood the earth. The problem with that is that it doesn't address, first of all, the waters beneath. They talked about in Genesis 7:11 talks about the waters of the great deep burst forth, or the fountains of the great deep burst forth. And it also doesn't account for a vapor canopy above the earth would create what's called a greenhouse effect, which would make the earth far too warm or far too hot to be inhabitable. And then another issue would be that it would obscure our view of the sky, of these heavenly bodies, the sun, the earth, or the sun and the moon and the stars, which God specifically says he put there so that they would mark off seasons and in times of for us. So this is a big reason why a lot of people have discarded the vapor canopy theory. I think, unfortunately, it was promoted for quite a few years, pretty heavily as the biblical flood model, and I think a lot of people, still probably cling to it. Few people do, because they may have never heard that there's scientific problems and biblical problems with it. So it's kind of like no way to know specifically how much damage the vapor canopy might have done, the vapor canopy theory might have done to the creation science movement. Now we discussed that Dr. Walt Brown, the author of the Hydroplate Theory, had struggled for many years, about 30 years actually, to understand Genesis 1 verse 8 and what that meant. And then he received a couple letters from a couple pastors that explained this to him in a way that really made sense to him. So one was Randy Alcorn, who wrote a book called Heaven, and then another was a man named Diego Rodriguez, and he wrote a book called Paradise, Past, Present, and Future, which I would highly recommend that you get, because it's a great short book that really is very concise, but really tells you what heaven is. And then there's a heaven of the past, a heaven of the present, and a heaven of the future. So we're going to kind of pick up there and talk just again a little bit about the particular meanings heaven can have in Scripture. And the meanings, of course, are determined by the context in which the passage puts it. So first, the heavens, or heaven, can mean the atmospheric heaven, that is, the atmosphere above the earth itself. And for example, it's the place where the birds fly, as referenced in Genesis 1:20. And also in Jeremiah 4:25 refers to heaven as the physical sky where the birds fly. Second, it can be the place where the sun, the moon, and stars are referenced, as it does in Genesis 1:17, for example, where this passage states this is where he places the sun, the moon, and the stars. So this would be what we would think of as outer space, beyond the Earth's atmosphere. It's pretty clear in context from some of those passages exactly what they're talking about. Like if you look at Genesis on day 4 of creation, it's obvious that it's talking about outer space. It's talking about the creation of the sun, the moon, and the stars. But the third possible understanding has to do with where God is, or where God's dwelling is. And Hebrews 9:24, for example, speaks of heaven as being where God's throne is located. And Nehemiah 9:6 refers to heaven as where the angels are. And Ezekiel 1:22 through 26 states that heaven is a place for God and spiritual beings. So keep this in mind, that these passages all come after the fall of man as described in Genesis 3, of course. So they're speaking of the present, what we think of now as the present state. So there's a past, which is pre-fall, the present state, or intermediate state, which is what we live in now, and the future state, which is the end of Revelation. We hear about that, where everything's restored back to its original pre-fall state, back to perfection. So when the context is of heaven as the place where God is located, heaven is best described as that unique place where God in his presence openly dwells with his creation. So all things, whether they're physical or non-physical, were created by God. God created everything. Therefore, wherever God chooses to openly dwell in the midst of his creation can rightly be called heaven. So heaven does not describe any place where God's presence is, but rather a specific place where God is uniquely present and where he has afforded, as Webster's dictionary described, a more sensible manifestation of his glory. So heaven is a place that God is uniquely described as being his habitation. Even though he's omnipresent, this is a special place. So this is something a little bit different than that. So although God is omnipresent, he's everywhere at once, heaven is, in this context, is special. It's God's special habitation. So heaven is unique. It was created. It can't be in two places at once like God can. Heaven's not omnipresent. Only God is omnipresent. And even heaven itself is something that God created. So God can change and move the heaven as he pleases, as we'll see here. And this is evident in the Word of God that he's changed this at the time of the fall. So before the fall, heaven has a different meaning than it does now, and will have a different meaning in the future when Christ returns. So it's evident that he's changed this, and the thought of this particular the thought of this paradise or heaven of the past was on earth before the fall, and this is why the word Shemayim, which is frequently translated as heaven, I think means the crust of the earth. When God names the expanse, or the raqia, he names it Shemayim. So if that's true, if that's correct, which I think it is, we're going to look at some other verses here this morning that back this up. This is significant. And so this verifies again this water crust, water mantle arrangement that's described in Genesis 1:6-8. So remember that God places man in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2:15, and the word Eden actually means paradise or place of delight. So in a very real way, regarding this kingdom of heaven on earth, Adam and Eve didn't have to die to go to heaven. I mean, they were already there. I mean, this was a special place. This is where God always intended them to be. And the rest of mankind was supposed to be there as well. So amazing. I mean, just kind of imagine how amazing this would have been to them. This is why I believe that the expanse, or raqia, originally meant heaven. This is a place where God dwelt, the original paradise. And so we can recall in Genesis 3:8-9 also that God walked and talked with Adam. So heaven, I believe, was originally on earth, or the earth's crust, this raqia. And this all changes, of course, at the fall, where Adam and Eve sin, and then they hide from God in the garden. What follows is that God and man are separated from each other. And this is the end of that paradise past and the initiation of the present intermediate state, in which, of course, we now live. And no longer does God openly dwell with his creation, with man. There is a heaven. We'll talk about this in a second, too. That's still present heaven, but it's not our final destination. And it's not the same as what it was before the fall. It's been changed. God has the ability to change what heaven is pre-fall, during our current state, and then at Christ's return. So even though the present heaven is in which we live is not our final destination, it still will be a wonderful place, as described by Paul in Philippians in chapter 1, verse 21 through 23. Here he states, "For to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. It is better by far than living here on earth under the curse." So Paul obviously desired to depart to a place that was better by far than living on earth. This is the heaven in which we live in today. So this is the time frame that we live in today. So we just have to kind of imagine how amazing this will be. And Scripture does say, it'll be beyond what we can even imagine. So however amazing the present heaven is, it's just a foreshadow of what will come. In Revelation 21:1, it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away. There was no longer any sea." So this is the time when heaven and earth are restored back. They're corrected, basically fixed, rejuvenated, so to speak. So the phrase heaven and earth here essentially means the same thing as saying the universe. So he's going to rejuvenate the universe and everything in it. And in the future, at Christ's return, there will be this new heaven and earth, and the present heaven, which we now live in, and earth will pass away. So we should understand that the present universe, or the whole creation, is currently subject to frustration, as noted in Romans 8:20 and 21. So due to the effects of sin in Genesis 3, the curse begins and the entire universe is subject to a state of imperfection and decay, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, with the hope that it will be one day liberated from its bondage of decay. So this is, again, found in Romans 8:20 and 21. So again, this is describing the present state in which we live when we're subject to the laws of thermodynamics. I've covered this in a previous class, or this is also called entropy, which basically is a scientific way of saying what we live in now is in a state of decay. Everything goes from a more orderly state to a less orderly state. It becomes less organized over time. It's a state of decay. So we'll see this as we go into the flood too, that everything goes from a more orderly state into a less orderly state. And we'll see the effects of the flood and what this cataclysmic event did to our planet. So our planet now is currently in a state of imbalance. That Dr. Brown calls the current phase we're in, as far as the flood phase, the recovery phase. So it started basically at the end of the flood. We're still in this recovery phase. The earth is basically trying to get back into balance. We'll talk about this a little more scientifically when we get to that section. But it's these imbalances that cause our earthquakes and our volcanoes and lava flow and lightning storms, hailstorms, tornadoes, tsunamis, avalanches, mudslides, radioactivity, all these things that are harmful to humans, as we discussed earlier, over the course of history. But this frustration is then corrected at the second coming of Christ. So the flood plays a role in this. And verse 3 and 4 of Revelation 21 says, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them.'" This is, again, this dwelling place with his creation. He's going to restore that to the pre-fall state. "They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God, and he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. The old order of things has passed away. This is amazing. I mean, we should be jumping for joy for this. I mean, this is what we look forward to. I mean, this is what we're going to look forward to. And once again, God's dwelling place, heaven, will be with us on this new earth, just as it was before the fall. So I think we can take this to the bank. It says, I am making everything new in verse 5. And then he states, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. I mean, this is going to happen. This is guaranteed. I mean, there's just no doubt that this is what's going to happen. So it's reliable. But numerous passages throughout the Bible do describe the present intermediate state, a state where heaven is clearly not the earth. And I just want to go through a couple of these passages because this is, again, just describing our current state. One's found in Deuteronomy 26:15. It says, look down from thy holy habitation from heaven, the word here is Shemayim again, and bless thy people of Israel, and the land which thou hast given us, as thou swearest unto our fathers, a land that floweth with milk and honey. So obviously this refers to where God is, and not outer space or the Earth's atmosphere, as Shemayim can mean, depending again on the context. And 2 Chronicles 30:27 states, the priests, the Levites, arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came up to his holy dwelling place, even unto heaven, a unique place, again, that God inhabits in our current intermediate state. All these passages, again, are from the same time frame we're living in now. So, and Psalms 123:1 says, I lift up my eyes to you who sit enthroned in heaven. Once again, this word is Shemayim, same word again. This obviously is talking about where God dwells. And then you move to the New Testament, there are a number of verses that express the same meaning as we see in the Old Testament regarding this dwelling place for God. And one is found in Luke 11:2, which reads, and he said to them, when ye pray, say, O Father who art in heaven, which is the Greek word oranos, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So this Greek word oranos is very similar meaning to the Old Testament Hebrew word Shemayim. And in that context, it can mean sky, it can mean the atmosphere, but it clearly can also mean the place where God dwells. So this is, again, this passage is describing this present state again. So if we just go back to our discussion on raqia, I want to discuss this word firmament for just a second, kind of tell you where this came from, because it's kind of interesting to go through this. So if we look at the Strong's Concordance back in 1890, James Strong published a catalog of all the meanings of every word in the Bible, and he counted the frequency of each Hebrew and Greek word's specific English translation. And for example, the Hebrew word raqa is the 7,554th word in the Strong's Hebrew dictionary, and it's translated in the New American Standard as hammered out twice, spread out 3 times, and similar in some other places. So a difficult to translate word can better be understood by studying its usages and context and other similar words. So the King James translators translated raqia as firmament because they thought that it involved something firm. But the specific meaning when Genesis was written is kind of still a little bit unknown. So the word firmament comes from the Septuagint. So the Septuagint's a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced by Jewish scholars in the 3rd century BC at the request of the Egyptian pharaoh. And they translate raqia into the Greek word stereoma, which connotates a solid structure. Again, so many things that all just kind of go back to the same, but this was a solid structure. This wasn't the sky, this wasn't the atmosphere, this was a solid structure. And later, this Greek connotation influenced Jerome to the extent that when he produced the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible around 400 AD, he used the Latin word firmamentum, which means a strong or steady, steadfast support. The Latin Vulgate is a Latin translation of the Bible, mostly completed by St. Jerome, who was an early Christian priest, a historian and a theologian in the late 4th century. And the term Vulgate comes from the Latin term vulgata, meaning a common or popular version, reflecting its purpose to make the Bible more accessible to the common people. It uses what is termed vulgar Latin, meaning the everyday language of the Roman people instead of the more formal classical Latin that was used by the upper class Roman people in the academic circles of the time. So this is just everyday language, basically. And at the time, the Vulgate became the standard Latin Bible and remained the standard Bible for over 1,000 years. This translation was very, very, very much used for a long time. And just on a little side note, it's kind of interesting, this is where we get the word vulgar in our English language. So over time, the meaning of vulgar shifted in the English language to encompass concepts like crude, coarse, or offensive, due to the association with the common people with a lack of refinement or sophistication. So St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate used the term firmamentium for raqia, which also denotes a solidness and firmness. And today, the phrase terra firma, which means solid ground, comes from this Latin term, this Latin firmamentium. And so the King James translators in AD 1611 translated raqia as firmament because I think they correctly saw it involved something firm or solid. And the translators merely transliterated this Latin word, and thus was born the word firmament. So transliteration basically is when a term is converted from one language to another, focusing on the representative sounds of the original term of the language as it's being translated rather than its meaning. So they wanted to keep the word that kind of sounded the same rather than translating it into what it meant. But the King James translators didn't probably know its specific meaning when Genesis was written. And today, of course, firmament has changed. Today, poetically, people think of firmament as the sky or the atmosphere or the heaven. And in modern Hebrew, the term raqia does mean sky or heavens. However, originally it probably meant something solid or firm, spread out or hammered as working into a metal sheet or plate. So instead of the English meanings of the word as originally used, we get a picture of a hammered out, pressed out solid. So raqa, the root word for raqia, is defined as a beaten or hammered out plate, something spread out or stamped over the surface of something. And this concept is also supported by its usage in other passages of the Old Testament. And this may explain why the Greek Septuagint translated raqia 16 out of 17 times with the Greek word stereoma, which means a firm or solid structure. So examples of the Greek word being used in the New Testament include Timothy 2:19, where it references God's solid foundation, stands firm, and also in 1 Corinthians 3:2 and Hebrews 15:12 and 5:12 and 5:14, where it uses this word to describe solid food versus milk. So it's also key to look at other popular or other uses of this particular word in other passages so we can aid us in determining the meaning of this word that we're studying here. So let's look at a couple passages that use the term raqa. So in Exodus 39:3, in making the ephod, which is a sleeveless garment worn by Jewish priests, they hammered out or beat out, or raqa, the gold into thin sheets, and then these sheets were then cut into strands and woven into the garment. Another passage we see a similar description of a metal hammered out situation here is found in Numbers 16:39. Here the metal is bronze. So Eliezer, the priest, collected the bronze censers, and censers are a vessel sometimes hung on a chain used for burning incense before the Lord, brought by those who had burned to death, and he had hammered out or raqa to overlay the altar. Isaiah 40:19 also states that the idol makers converted the idols that they made, or covered the idols that they made with a thin sheet of gold. The goldsmith overspreads or raqa it with gold, thus it was gold plated. And another passage that warns us against making idols that are described here as being plated with silver and gold, and they're hammered out into thin sheets. In Jeremiah 10:9, it says that they hammered out or raqa silver is brought from Tarshish and gold from Euphaz. So again, this word means to plate something. So all these preceding passages point to the understanding that raqia or raqa is a relatively thin coating And when we look again at the Earth here, this coating, or this, would be relatively thin to the Earth's, the diameter of the Earth. I mean, we've got a 60-mile raqia. Basically, that's what Dr. Brown estimates. This crust basically would have been about 60 miles thick, but that's a small, fraction of the diameter of the Earth. So he also puts water in here. The passage states that water was divided, badal, which basically is a Hebrew word that means to split in half or to divide, in the midst of, which is a Hebrew word tavek, which means to basically to split in two. He divides this water above and below. So we're going to look at a couple other passages through here that go through this. These are amazing passages when you look at this, because this just fits this idea perfectly. So again, we mentioned earlier the Hebrew word for water is mayim, which is always used to describe liquid water only. So water, of course, very important during creation. Genesis 1:2 states that the water was a key component on day one, and of course Genesis 1:6-7 centers around these waters, of course, and divides them. But there are a number of passages that describe the same arrangement. So it's important that are outside of Genesis. So I think it's important to have some corroboration here, basically, that backs this up from other passages. So there are a number of other passages that describe this. So again, this becomes the main starting assumption upon which we'll interpret today's geology, what the Earth is today. This is going to come a little later in the more scientific end of the class. So now I'm trying to show all the biblical support for this arrangement. Then when we get past this, we'll go into the scientific parts of this. And what happens basically when there's a rupture in the crust, what follows from that? And that's basically the hydroplate theory. And everything's all based on well-known scientific principles. And it all flows. It's amazing when you put it all together. So one of these passages we're going to look at here is Psalms 24:1-2, where it states God creates the earth on the waters. It says the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. He founded it on the seas. The word used here is mayim, of course, liquid water, and established it on the waters. The different word here is used nahar. Basically, they're pretty similar words. It establishes on the water, and this word nahar can mean different things, again, depending on context. It can mean seas, waters, rivers, streams, or canals. But clearly this passage supports the idea that earth is founded on the seas and established on the waters. So clearly this is a creation reference, and that the earth was founded on these seas, established it. It's also interesting that Strong's Concordance indicates that nahar means seas, and by an extension, a container for holding water. So if you look at seas, there's shorelines on the sea, right, that kind of hold the water in, so to speak. It's kind of that same thing. It's a container. Well, again, we'll get to that in just a minute. But this answers the question now, where did this water come from? This is one of the major questions, is how could there be enough water to totally cover the earth during the flood? Because today it's not possible. I mean, we couldn't cover the whole highest mountains we have now. So let's just, since we're on this subject, I just want to look at this briefly here. There being enough water to cover the entire Earth's surface. So I want to bring up the slide now and discuss this briefly. And I'll probably bring the slide up again later on. It's a pretty cool slide here. Was there enough water to completely cover the surface of the earth during the flood, as Scripture records? So when the pre-flood surface waters and subterranean waters were combined, so the surface waters and the subterranean waters combined when the fountains of the great deep burst forth, this water now is plenty of water to cover the earth. So if we look at the actual amount of surface water the earth has today and realize what we see in the oceans and surface waters is all that water combined together, except for there are some small pockets of water that are still trapped well below the earth's surface. We've discovered this well deeper than surface water should ever be. This is another big indicator of that this raqia, this arrangement was correct, because surface water should never get anywhere near as deep as it's been discovered. We'll go through that in a second here too. Realize that the vast majority of water is now in our Earth's oceans And today our oceans cover about 70% of our Earth's surface. And the average depth of the oceans in on the Earth today is about 12,000 feet. Just think about that. That's over 2 miles. That's the average depth of our oceans. It's a lot of water. I mean, that's a lot of water. And the deepest part of the ocean is what's called the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. It's much deeper than that. It's actually 35,876 feet deep. So we're talking, places for a lot of water to go here. So this becomes where the water goes after the flood. These great deep ocean basins. So this gives a place for the water to go. So the Earth's surface is not permanently covered by water after the flood. So this opening of the deep basins occurs during the second phase of the flood that Dr. Brown calls the flood phase. So massive shifts occur deep in the earth, causing this to happen. And we'll discuss this a little bit as well. Biblically, this receding of the waters is recorded in Scripture starting in Genesis 8:3-4, where it states that the waters steadily recede from the earth until the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So these deep basins hadn't formed yet during the beginning stages of the flood, but we can see later that they were recorded as actually happening sometime during the first 40 days of the flood. These deep basins actually are formed, probably some months after the start of the flood. We don't know for sure, but another aspect too that we'll see later is the current mountains on the earth are pushed up greatly and are now much higher than they would have been before the flood. So the volume of water we have right now is plenty to cover the Earth's surface. So what you're looking at now on the screen is a cross-section of today's Earth. You'll see the land areas. That's actually the mid-oceanic ridge, which is fascinating. We'll get to that. And then land over there. And of course, these are the surface waters on the ocean. But what if we bulldozed all that off? What if the surface was flat? Watch the little bulldozer go here. It's a great animation, right? So if we bulldoze that all over, we would see how this would be entirely possible. So to illustrate this, how much water is on the earth today, if the mountains and continents of the earth were bulldozed flat, the volume of water today in today's oceans would cover the entire earth to a depth of about 9,000 feet. Close to 2 miles. I mean, this is getting close to 2 miles of depth. So there's plenty of water. If these deep ocean basins hadn't formed yet, which again I think will show as a result of the flood. No question?
So I'm just trying to understand. So when the base of the trench arrives, that's when it pushes up the mountains?
Well, we'll talk about that later. There's something called the compression event, which is part of the hydroplate theory. When the plates shift apart and they run into resistance, they crush and compress. That pushes up the mountains. It's really amazing. We'll get to that, but that's not quite yet. So we'll get there. So the problem is that we don't know where is not that we don't know where the water came from the flood, because we can see it from any beach in the world right now. So understanding this then answers where did all this water come from? And again, the subterranean chambers combining with the surface waters gives us plenty. So slide here. So another amazing passage indicating that the earth was created with deep subterranean water is found in Psalms 136, 5-9. This is a song of thanks to God, and it deserves a special comment here as well. So noted in this chapter and in this phrase, in this passage, the phrase "His love endures forever" is inserted between each of these statements. I've removed those to make it easier to see the significance of this passage as we look at this, in the context of our current discussion here. So with that phrase, "His love endures forever," removed, it reads, "Who by his understanding made the heavens, who spread out, or raqa, the earth upon the waters, who made the great lights, the sun to govern the day, the moon to govern the stars, the moon and stars to govern the night." So this passage here describes 3 sequential events. It says the heavens were made on day 1. Well, God states he made the heavens, that is the physical space that becomes our universe. It says the earth is spread out above the waters on the second day, raqa. So this now ties raqa and raqia together. Okay? now I think we can see specifically that this is the intention of this, of what raqa meant back in that early passages. Not in the 5th through 9th usage, in Genesis 1, where it talks about the moon and the sun and the stars, but in the first 4 usages, this is what I think is describing this here. So if this proposed interpretation is correct, then this precisely parallels the creation events of day 1, 2, and 4. Here it significantly states that it's on day 2 that this spread out raqa, which I think is the granite shell, was spread out over the waters, on top of the waters. And again, this is very strong support for the concept that the crust of the earth was stretched out. It was a solid that divided the liquid water above from the liquid water below. And if this is the correct understanding of this passage, I think Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory is easily the correct flood model. We'll go through the other flood model in a few weeks. Next week or two, I'll go through catastrophic plate tectonics, which is the other model. And it has serious scientific and biblical issues as well. So this should confirm, I think, that the hydroplate theory is the correct model. Another passage is Psalms 33, 6 through 7. This is another passage that clearly speaks of creation and the seas or waters being contained below the surface of the earth. This passage reads, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea into jars. He puts the deep into storehouses." So this passage states that the waters were put into jars or storehouses. What do you do with a jar, right? It's to contain something, right? Or storehouses. They're closed in below the surface and held there for what must have been some kind of a purpose. There must be a reason for this. And one distinctly possible and likely purpose would be as an energy source for mankind after the earth is created. We'll go through what's called tidal pumping, which basically is the influence of the moon that has on the earth to create movement in this crust. And this creates a lot of heat in the crust, which warms the earth. So it's pretty incredible. It's like this was an energy source prior to the flood for the pre-flood earth. Another is that this water is reserved for a purpose later, and it's the source of the flood waters that come in earth's judgment, as we see in Genesis 7. Another passage in Isaiah 42:5 says that God spreads out or forth the earth. The word here is spread out or spread forth is raqa. Again, so this passage again reads, this is what God the Lord says, the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, and stretches out the heavens, we talked about that previously, who spreads out or raqa the earth with all that springs from it. And just like Psalms 136, 5 through 9 that we just read, it was God the creator who spread out or raqa the earth. So nice to have multiple passages that state this. A lot of times, you might be a little doubt if there's only one passage, but you got multiple passages that state the same thing. And we're not done yet. There's actually more. 2 chapters later in Isaiah in 44:24, it says again that God spreads out or raqas the earth. So this passage reads, I am the Lord, the maker of all things, who stretches out the heavens, who spreads out raqa the earth by myself. I think this is pretty amazing. This is really amazing stuff here. So this now brings us to what would occur on day 3. So the third day of creation. So we've gone through Genesis 1, 6 through 8, describing day 2. And now we see in Genesis 1, 9 through 10, where it describes the third day of creation, describing the formation of land out of what had begun on day 2. So I want to read this passage. This is from the New King James Version. It says, And God said, Let the waters under the heavens be gathered unto one place. Let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. God saw that it was good. So on the third day, we see that the waters of the heaven had not yet been gathered together in order to form dry land. This occurs on day 3. Perhaps as we previously stated, the waters of subterranean chambers might have been in perfect balance during day 2. And I got to thinking about this. I think this was kind of significant. If you've got this water below and water above and this expanse between, if there's any imbalance in any of that, I think this land formation might have actually started on day 2. This is speculation. This is my speculation. Take it for what it is. But I think God probably in his perfection made this expanse uniform and perfect during day 2, so it was in perfect equilibrium until day 3, when I think he probably changes it somewhat so that some of that crust becomes more dense than other areas, allowing it to sink to then create this this situation where land appears. So I think, again, this is kind of a speculation. I think it kind of makes sense, but I mean, it's a guess. But to me, that seems to make perfect sense. Why wouldn't this dry land appear on day 2 then? I mean, I think this equilibrium might have been just something God did. So I'm going to do this over the 7 days, the creation over the 6 days, and the resting on the 7th day to set up our pattern for our week that we still use today. So I think that's the reason why he does it this way. So massive physical changes take place during day 3, as we'll see here. So at the end of first creation day, water thus covered the earth. The preceding passages all point to this understanding that raqia is this relatively thin crust above the earth. And then as we see on day 3, there are numerous Bible verses that, again, confirm that there's large quantities of water below the crust. So these illustrations here are probably going to illustrate this. So here is what we see on the upper right here. God made this raqia that separates or sharply divides, which is badal, the Hebrew word badal, the liquid water, mayim, above liquid water from below. And then what we see on day 3 is land rises out of the surface. So what ends up happening is the heavier, more dense parts of the crust now sink, and they rest on the floor below here. And this is something that Dr. Brown calls a pillar, basically. So as this deforms, as you look at this crust that would have been huge, it would have had some flexibility to it. I mean, you don't think about rock as being terribly flexible, but over a very, very large area, it can be. And so this allows the heavier parts to sink and rest on the mantle below, forming what Dr. Brown calls pillars, and we'll see this term in Scripture too. And that allows the dry land to form, because that's pressed up now. This is kind of exaggerated, obviously, for illustration purposes here. It really wasn't, this proportions, but this now allows dry land to occur, just as Genesis 1 or just as day 3 says. So it kind of makes a lot of sense. And again, this raqia here was, by Dr. Brown's estimate, around 60 miles thick. I heard the bell. I know we're out of time. It's always too fast, So. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
You bet.
Thanks, Steve.
We believe you're all